What gives me the greatest concern of what is taking place is the anxiety that it's creating with its NATO members. What President Trump is proposing is actually going to decrease security because the most important part of working with allies is...
Welcome back to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference.
It is incredible to have you today, sir. There's a number of topics I want to cover, but I want to start things off with discussing Greenland, because this has been an item in the headlines recently. Obviously, President Trump and the Trump administration making it very clear that they want to acquire Greenland for what they call national security reasons, going so far as to even allude that it could happen militarily. Now, Trump walked back some of these comments in his recent speech at Davos, saying he would not attack Greenland, and he was going to pause some of the tariffs he had put on EU member states who had been opposed to that move. What are your thoughts, and how do you see all of this ending up? Do you think we could see the US acquire Greenland? Is it all talk? Will action occur? What are your thoughts?
Let's just start off with an easy question, right? So first of all, when it comes to Greenland and Denmark, very strong partners with Canada. I can tell you that we had disagreements in the past, but it's been dealt with in a proper diplomatic way. And what I can say is the comments by President Trump when it comes to Greenland obviously is a significant concern. And our Prime Minister has actually stated very clearly, it's up to the people in Greenland and Denmark to decide what the future is going to hold. What I would, just before answering that question, what gives me the greatest concern of what is taking place is the anxiety that it's creating with its NATO members. Because you have the transatlantic bond that has, really, I would say, after World War II, kind of provided that sense of security around the world. And that's what has been damaged. I'm confident that there will be a solution that would satisfy President Trump, that will alleviate some of the concerns. When it comes to security, we know what those security concerns are. When I was Minister of Defense, I had a daily brief that looked at, because Greenland is in an area that's very strategic of importance. I would get briefed on these just as the Secretary of Defense would be briefed. So we play a very important role. So we know the importance of Greenland. But the thing is, we have to work together. What President Trump is proposing is actually going to decrease the security, because the most important part of working with allies is us working together and providing that sense of deterrence. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I'm confident there will be a pathway forward. And the reason I say this, I was there during the first Trump administration, and I've been to the White House a number of times, and twice there with President Trump, and we were able to work out some very difficult issues. This would be another one that's on the list that hopefully can be worked out.
And where does this put NATO at the moment? Because the majority of NATO's funding and military assets come from the United States, and now there seems to be a conflict of interest between the United States and other NATO member nations. Are we entering a scenario where NATO could potentially fracture or cease to exist as it is today? Or do you think, as you mentioned, that this will eventually be resolved and NATO will remain intact as it is today?
I don't think it's going to fracture, but it is damaged. The NATO alliance and our unity is the most important deterrence that we have. And when you cannot rely on one another, or if that reputation is damaged, that does cause some concern. And that's probably my biggest concern. I mean, I text with some of the former secretaries of defense in the US and even current serving members, where, they'll be passing on their concerns, saying, listen, don't lose hope on the US. But one thing I can tell you is that, yes, it's creating anxiety, but having said this, every NATO member did need to kind of pony up and stand up more. And I remember a conversation that I had with President Trump some time ago at a NATO conference, and I said it straight out, that NATO members did need to increase their funding, including Canada. I was a Minister of Defense when our budget was at $18 billion. We had pulled a lot of our support from NATO at that time, and we need to come up with a credible plan to build that credibility again. And I told President Trump at that time, we were at 0.9% approximately of that 2% target. And I said, we put a defense policy together that took 2 years to put together, and in the first defense policy, part one of that, we increased the defense budget by 70%. Essentially, we were going to double our budget, but because when you start at 0.9%, you can't get up to, for example, I'll just tell you the number, it was $56 billion when you calculate it up to 2%. You can't spend that much money that quickly in that short period of time. So we built out a very credible plan, but more importantly, what we said was it's going to be a 20-year plan, and we're going to lock in that funding for 20 years. The first time a defense policy had locked it in. This was our way of showing not only the US, but also our NATO allies that we were serious about defense. This money will not be touched, and you will have predictability. We will invest in the capabilities that are needed for Canada and for our allies, but more importantly, we are willing to contribute assets. One of the first things we did was we took the lead in Latvia. It started with a battle group, and now it's up to a brigade. We were actually providing air policing. We started reinvested in research projects. So we had to show that credibility. We were in Iraq fighting ISIS together. We led the training mission for NATO. In fact, actually twice we were there. So we not only put the money on the line, we invested in the right capabilities. And I remember at that time, President Trump knew that the first defense policy we put together was going to get us to about 1.44, and he was actually very happy with that, saying progress has been made, right? And now Prime Minister Carney is now finishing up the plan to not only get up to 2%, but actually working on our Canadian industrial base and getting up to that 5%. This shows the importance of what all our NATO allies are doing. And I think what it should stand as a message, the original message that President Trump had, yes, we are spending more. But one thing we have to be very mindful of is defense spending is not the most important thing. It's defense spending in the right capabilities that you can contribute to the alliance, and so they could utilize it. That is probably the most important things, and what's something that Canada has been doing now.
Great summary there. I'd love to quickly talk about Davos and the speeches given by both Prime Minister Carney and Donald Trump there, seeming like a little bit of conflict has arisen in reference to the drama we were just talking to surrounding Greenland. But what are your thoughts? Because Prime Minister Carney received a lot of praise for his speech at Davos for being calm and measured, kind of the contrast to Trump's a little bit of a bully pulpit type of attitude about things. How did you view that, and how do you view Mark Carney so far in terms of the job he's done in steering the ship that is Canada?
Thank you very much for your comments there. I mean, everybody has a right. As a former soldier, we fight for our democracy, and everybody has a right for their viewpoints on our political system. But one thing I can tell you, I think Prime Minister Carney was the right person as Prime Minister for our time right now. And his speech that he gave, and I actually sent a message to him saying this was a speech that was needed, and I'll tell you why. Far too long, when we look at Canada, we sometimes look at ourselves as we're second cousin, we're second rate, or we don't have the ability. I can tell you, there are certain things that we do in Canada that the US relies on. They cannot function in certain things, and obviously can't share that level of information, cannot function without us. This is not to say, oh, look at us, that we need greater praise. This shows the importance of our collaboration with our most important partner. What people don't realize that we are already so integrated. Some of our Canadian generals are deputy commanders of the US corps in the US, including Alaska. At NORAD, the commander of NORAD is always US. When I was Minister of Defense and the current Minister of Defense, reports to the Minister of Defense and to the Secretary of Defense. So our capabilities of what we have, this is something that we don't talk about, and we do things around the world that we don't televise much, but I can tell you, when we do things, it brings significant credibility to our allies. So, I remember when I got into politics and I became a minister, and a lot of times it was recommended, well, let's wait for that nation, somebody to take the lead, and then we can go into support. And I'll be honest with you, I disagreed with that. My thing was that we should be standing up for what we feel is right. We are a nation. If we think we need to do something, stand up and say it, and let's do it. And let's lead on it. And I can tell you this, we have done this many times. Rather that we know because of our size and our economy, we can't be the same size as the US or some other nations. But what we do focus on, we do it well. And I mentioned to you backstage, and I'll share this with you. Do you remember, we have multiple crises that happen around the world. Sometimes we tend to forget. Do you remember the North Korean missile crisis that we were dealing with not too long ago? Well, I'll tell you, in Vancouver, myself as Minister of Defense, and the US Secretary of Defense, and our Foreign Affairs Minister, we hosted all the foreign affairs ministers of all the nations that fought during the Korean War. We brought here together and are met here in Vancouver to talk about how we, the US and Canada as a military, are what operations we can contribute on to support the diplomatic effort, which turned into the sanctions monitoring mission with us in the US against North Korea, which gave the credibility for the diplomatic conversations to increase for our diplomatic corps in all the various countries to work together to push for a greater dialogue, which led to President Trump and Kim Jong-un having their summit in, I believe it was Singapore at that time. We led this conversation. So when it comes to the Prime Minister and talking about the reality, it's good that Canada and he is leading on that conversation because he is saying what everybody has been thinking. But you can do it in a respectful way. As you can see here, listen, I have my viewpoints about many nations around the world, many leaders. I've met a lot of them, got to see many things. I've met President Trump 3 times, twice at the White House. Obviously, there's many things that I disagree with. But at that time, I'm not there as Harjit Sajjan, I'm there representing my country. And even though I'm out of politics, I'm very mindful what I say does matter. So I'm not here to bash anybody, I'm here to figure out how we can work together. So Prime Minister Carney is setting the stage to say, listen, the middle powers do play a very important role. There is no superpower that can do it alone. Yes, you can do one-off operations or lead in a few things. But when it comes to major scale operations or even diplomatic efforts, you cannot do it alone. And one thing that Canada has done incredibly in our history is when we come up with a plan, it brings credibility. And I can give you countless times that we have done this in our past, and I'm actually glad that Prime Minister Carney is kind of showing what Canada does. Sometimes we're far too humble that people don't realize how good we are at what we do. We have some agencies that will blow people's mind. I can't talk about some of the things that we do. Sometimes it's so highly classified. One thing I can tell you, it would make Canadians so proud that we have Canadians that are so bright, working on things that absolutely would blow people's mind, that when I go into certain meetings, I'll give you an example. When we used to go fight ISIS, there wasn't a meeting when the 13 nations got together that Canada was not praised for a target that needed to be captured. We may not have all the higher aircraft, but what we do have, like for example, our special forces. You guys heard about Delta Force and SEAL Team 6? We have ours at that level. Tier 1 special forces, they work together. And all our troops are very good at what they do. But here's the thing though, you can have the best asset in the world. If you don't know which door to kick, if you don't know which bomb to drop and where to drop it, it's useless. What we put on the ground allowed our allies to target appropriately, and we were we did it in a way that brought immediate credibility. And not just giving the military, there's many other things I can talk about. CSE, you guys know what CSE is? The Communication Security Establishment? It's equivalent of the NSA. That's one, it's an agency that also is run by the Minister of National Defense. So highly classified, within the Five Eyes, we do such amazing things. And the only reason we do it, because we attract such amazing talent. And it's the most highly classified area that we work, and I can tell you, we have helped our allies around the world, even in Europe, prevent terrorist attacks that take place. We have intercepted so many drugs that were about to enter the US because of this work. We were doing drug interdiction in the south called Operation Carib with the US Coast Guard for I think it was at least a decade. So we do so many things, I can tell you, that the US actually relies on, and what Prime Minister Carney just did was speak what everybody was thinking, but more importantly, demonstrate to people that middle powers do have a lot of credibility when you work together. And I'm glad that we can take a lead on this, and I texted him, and I will say that I did hear from a colleague of mine that he actually, I think, penned that speech himself.
Very interesting. I would love to get your thoughts on what seems to be a burgeoning trade cooperation between Canada and China, with Mark Carney meeting President Xi, coming to a trade agreement which included a memorandum of understanding surrounding energy markets, which is very interesting to me. It's getting some criticism. Some people are saying that China is an enemy of the West and that we shouldn't be involved in trade with them. But from a pragmatic viewpoint, do you think this was the right move, and what do you think the implications could be for the Canadian economy?
So first of all, I think it's very irresponsible of anybody to say we should stop communicating. We need to make sure that we are communicating with everybody. I mean, I've done work here in Vancouver where I had to deal with directly organized crime figures, and if we didn't communicate with them, we wouldn't be able to do our jobs as police. I've worked in Afghanistan where I had to talk to Taliban commanders. So when we're talking in a diplomatic sense, it is our job to have diplomatic conversation with nations we disagree with, and especially when it comes to human rights and other things. But at the same time, we need to find common ground on how we can change things. Because if we don't, all we're doing is just slapping each other in the face and not making any progress for one another. We need to understand what the viewpoints are. And I'll tell you, when it comes to China, first of all, I don't think Prime Minister Carney is moving towards a trade agreement, and these are his words, but we needed to cool things down a little bit when it comes to some of the tariffs that were taking place and having a significant impact on our own economy. So when it comes to China, and I've dealt with the security implications when it comes to China, and what my viewpoint always was, and I used to communicate with my counterpart there, is what we need to do is have predictability. We will tell you certain things we will not be talking about. We will not be sharing certain pieces of technology. This is a red line now. We are not there at this point. And we will do whatever is necessary to protect that. And we have some very high level capability in the technology field that we do need to protect. Right? However, let's work on areas of commonality. Let's work on creating better economic opportunities for both our countries. One question we had earlier on before, sadly, before things went rightfully so, when our two Michaels were arrested, we were working together on how we can increase our search and rescue capability, responding to disasters, especially in the Asia Pacific. At RIMPAC operation, the exercise that we conduct in the Pacific, China used to be part of that to participate on how we can respond to disasters. There's nothing wrong with that. Or one area, how can Canada help China on how to do peacekeeping together? Something that we have done very well in the past. So what we were trying to do is find common ground on areas that we're willing to work on, but actually have a clear delineation. Here's our red line of what we're not willing to talk about yet. What that allows us to do is have good diplomatic opportunities that can find economic opportunity for us, and at the same time, open the door so that we can have those difficult discussions. We can talk about human rights. We can talk about the Uyghur issue. We can talk about some of the concerns that we have in our own Arctic sovereignty of what potentially China is going to be doing there. But if you don't have ability to communicate, we are going to be making decisions in a vacuum, and that's a dangerous place to be. And sadly, a lot of these decisions, if you see right now, have been taking place around the world, have escalated certain things where we shouldn't have gone to.
Let's talk about critical minerals and the importance of critical minerals as a defense strategy in Canada, something you spent a lot of your career on. Walk us through how you think the current state of critical minerals extraction is in Canada right now. Which are the main minerals that we should be focused on? And do you think that the Canadian government is doing enough to incentivize the critical minerals industry right now?
So I think the conversation and discussion on critical minerals is gotten to a much better place what it used to be. I would say when I was talking about critical minerals, it wasn't even on anybody's agenda. And how critical minerals came onto our government's agenda and many others was a result of a security conversation we had in the Pacific within our Five Eyes community. By the way, anybody who doesn't know Five Eyes, it's a Canada, US, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand working. We have an intelligence arrangement where we can move and share classified information at the highest level. So when we have these type of discussions, we're able to look and speak way more freely. What we were looking at was some of the concerns when it comes to some of what our critical minerals are used for. You have a far better knowledge than I do probably on this. I can't even list off all the critical minerals, but one thing I do know, they're critical to some of our military systems that are absolutely needed. And so we had to look at it as how do we make sure that we have a safe supply of these critical minerals for national security. So it became a national security issue. And so as we were having these type of discussions, and what can we do? One of the things was that China already is the leader on processing of critical minerals. So now there's a separate discussion I think that should have been had in the past. How was China allowed to get to that level without us doing this early on? Why weren't we looking at refining of our critical minerals and looking at this issue a lot sooner? So we have to kind of look at these things and now use it as a lesson learned so that we don't get in these situations again. But that was a reality. So we needed to figure out how do we do this. So I believe in 2017, in the throne speech, we got critical minerals on the government agenda, and which allowed for us to have a much stronger discussion within our allies to how to do this. So as the discussion went on, every time we wanted to talk about critical minerals, as you know, China is a monopoly on when it comes to refining, they would just dump the market and bring the prices down. So we had to increase our conversation on this, and I'm glad even before I left government, we were having discussions on we need to invest in our own refining technology of our critical minerals, and governments also need to play a very important role into this, where they need to potentially guarantee certain prices so that to allow the companies to succeed. So that's when it comes to critical minerals. It's absolutely necessary for us. And here's the thing though, I have seen the technology myself. I believe Saskatchewan has put a lot of money into one refining of the critical minerals. I've personally seen some interesting technology even in Ontario that can refine certain minerals, actually repurpose certain minerals and can be used in the refining if we put enough R&D into this. So I'm confident in Canada with the amazing, the natural resource skills that we actually have, we can come up with this technology. What this will allow us to do is look at certain things like critical minerals that are necessary for not only Canada's national security, but also our allies' national security. Now imagine this. Now imagine with all the critical minerals that we have. So rather than, and I'll say this, is rather than the US trying to have those type of discussions where it creates greater anxiety, imagine working together with us and how we in the US can work together on the extraction and quicker approval of that process, refining of some of these critical minerals so that we can have much more certainty when it comes to our national security. These are the discussions that we really should be having, rather than looking at some of the other challenges that are taking place. And I'm confident these discussions are taking place because I remember even during when I was still in government, sometimes in the news there's a lot of anxiety being created by certain things. But I remember some of the discussions that I would have, whether it's with my counterparts or even sometimes with President Trump there, we would actually find some common ground and move things forward. The unpredictability that sometimes, and I'll say this, that we see in the news through President Trump, I have seen some predictability when backdoor conversations have occurred. And the reason I say this, I have to be an optimist given the work that I used to do. And I have confidence within the diplomats here in Canada. And believe it or not, I had the confidence within the people that I have worked with in the US as well to come up with a common ground for this. But having said this, it's going to be a very bumpy road still ahead. And I think with the Prime Minister, with his speech, will demonstrate and showcase, whether it's to President Trump, President Putin, or any other potential player in the superpower world, that middle powers do have a say.
I'd love to get back to the realm of geopolitics for a moment and talk about the war in Ukraine and specifically Canada funding for the war, because so far we've spent over $34 billion. It does not look like, at least many analysts believe that it has not helped much. It has simply extended the war, all of the funding Ukraine has gotten. Many people, including Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who will be out here later, believes that Ukraine has no chance of winning this battle militarily, regardless of what happens. So, what is your view on that? And should Canada really continue to be funding that conflict? Because we had Zelensky come to Canada at the end of last year, and Mark Carney committed more support for Ukraine. We're in a situation where the cost of living crisis is spiraling out of control for a lot of Canadians. There's a lot of places, I think, at home that capital could be deployed. Is there still a justifiable reason, in your view, to keep sending money to Ukraine?
First of all, absolutely. So my answer to this is going to be a little bit biased. Those of you who don't know me, when I became Minister of Defense, I went to Ukraine the first time, and I had to revamp our mission there. And why? Because my experience as we were fighting ISIS and some of my own personal experience, we needed to train our training mission to help the Ukrainians on the front line. And we couldn't advertise a lot at that time what we were doing on the training. We just called it a training mission. But what we did was, rather than them come to us, to the West, and train at the lower level, they were already very good at what they did. What we wanted to do was increase their capability and increase certain capabilities that's going to help them right on the front line. And to answer your question kind of bluntly and then explain why, is we can't afford not to. Because if we don't, I can assure you we'll be spending a lot more money down the road, all our nations, on this, and we'll have even a greater security risk if we don't continue to support Ukraine. So one is, absolutely. When it comes to, first of all, the history of Ukraine, they already gave up their nuclear weapons for the guaranteed security. Well, that guarantee never took place. Right? As we changed our mission, training mission there, and we revamped it, there were 4 nations conducting this training. Canada was probably with the lead on it with the number of troops and what we were doing. UK was also there, very credible, and Poland was also there. And the US was there, to an extent. They were at a good number as well, but there were 4 nations. Every NATO meeting I went to, I urged our European allies to join our training mission. And Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU, used to be the defense minister of Germany at that time, and she knows this. And I used to urge them to join us on our training mission because I said, more European nations join us, it'll be a stronger deterrence. And at that time, the advice that was given to most nations was, let's not escalate the situation. And our assessment was, the situation is going to be escalated if we don't continue to do what we need to do. And I'll tell you this, anybody thinks that Ukraine cannot, I'm not saying that when it comes to the war, it's not going to be a tough battle. But one thing I can tell you, anybody thinks that Ukraine can't handle its own, when the invasion took place, the assessment was, Ukraine may not even last a week, that things are going to be overrun. And I'll say this from what a Ukrainian soldier was interviewed, I believe it was a Wall Street Journal article, and it made me very proud of what our troops did on the ground. They said, how were you able to protect the capital from the Russians? I think that was a basic question. And he goes, we just did what the Canadians taught us to do. So the Rapid Response Brigade was one of the last things that we were trained them. We were training them on NATO standards. We revamped their entire training mission. We revamped how they made decisions. You know how Ukraine is very good on drone warfare? When I saw their technology and I signed the defense arrangement with Ukraine, we opened up our drone technology way early on to them. We knew what they were good at. So we were helping to build their capability to a high level. So now, yes, with the Europeans stepping up, with Canada stepping up and others, Ukraine can get to, I believe, a very good position where they can actually negotiate their own future. And that's potentially what will happen. But if we think now by not investing, that this is going to be good for us. Yes, we have pressures. I can guarantee you, imagine what will happen down the road when President Putin thinks he can go to another step. What would that cost us? Just like before, look in the past, if the Europeans had joined us on this mission, could we have potentially prevented Putin from actually invading if we had more European troops on the ground, credibly training Ukrainians even more, revamping their ability? We potentially could have prevented that bigger invasion. So I vehemently support our support for Ukraine because it's a necessity. And I can proudly say that when I met President Zelensky the first time at his inauguration, I was the first Canadian to meet him. When I met with him, because the propaganda was talking about who he was and stuff, that man cared about his people because he cared about his family. I knew that he was a good leader. And so it was no surprise to me when the plane was offered up to evacuate him out, and he said, don't send me a plane, send me bullets. So we will be very strong in Ukraine, and for a good reason. And if we don't, we'll be spending way more dollars as a repercussion of that.
Well, Harjit, this has been a fantastic conversation. We covered so many topics. Thank you for being so gracious with your time. Everybody, please, a warm round of applause for the Honorable Harjit Sajjan.